There is a particular kind of heat that builds in a kitchen that has been running since before sunrise. By 9 in the morning, the biscuits are already done, the broth is already moving in its pot, and whatever is going on, the noon table is already underway. In an Amish household during harvest season, a kitchen can be in full production for 6, 7, 8 hours before the hottest part of the day even arrives. And yet, if you walked into one of those kitchens, into a farmhouse in Kishokokilis Valley, say, or anywhere in the broad stretch of Holmes County where the farms run close and the cooking never really stops, you would notice something that takes a moment to name. It is not hot in the way you expect. The air is moving, the surfaces stay manageable. The cook is not fighting the room. Most of us have had the experience of cooking a large meal in a modern home. Thanksgiving, a big Sunday dinner, a summer canning afternoon that turned the whole house into something resembling a sauna, and finishing it feeling like we have survived something rather than created something. The kitchen is a different temperature than every other room in the house. The windows have fogged and cleared and fogged again. The exhaust fan has been running so long it has become background noise. The whole space needs time to recover before anyone wants to stand in it again. That sensation is so familiar to most people that it simply gets folded into the experience of cooking. You make food, you get hot, that is the deal. The Amish made a different deal, and the terms of it go back much further than most people realize. When the first Amish settlers moved into Lancaster County in the early 1700s, formally establishing roots in what would become one of the most storied and productive farming regions in American history, they carried with them a body of domestic knowledge developed across generations in the farmhouses of Alsace and the Palatinate. In those regions, long, cold winters and short, intense summers had created a particular kind of pressure on the people who cooked for large households. Heat was precious in January and punishing in July, and the farmhouse kitchen had to negotiate both without becoming uninhabitable in either direction. These were not abstract design challenges. They were daily physical realities that shaped every decision made about how a house was built, how a stove was managed. And when certain kinds of cooking happened, the settlers who arrived in Pennsylvania did not invent their solutions on American soil. They brought a fully formed philosophy of heat management that had already been tested across decades in a different climate. And then they spent the next 200 years refining it against the specific conditions of the Mid-Atlantic and Midwest. What emerged? What you walk into today in a working Amish farmhouse in Mifflin County or Wayne County, or the wide farming townships of northern Indiana, is not tradition preserved out of sentiment. It is a working system that has been continuously validated by the people using it every summer without interruption for 3 centuries. The first thing you notice when you start paying close attention is where the kitchen sits. In a traditional Amish farmhouse, the kitchen is positioned deliberately relative to the land around it. The longer exterior wall faces the direction of the prevailing summer breeze. In much of central Pennsylvania, that means a southwest orientation, and windows are placed on opposing walls to create a natural crossdraft. This is passive ventilation in its purest form. No mechanism, no electricity, no cost beyond the thought that went into the original placement of the building. Air enters from one side, crosses the cooking space, and exits from the other, carrying heat with it continuously as long as the fire is burning. The effect is not dramatic. It does not make the kitchen cold, but it means the kitchen never becomes sealed, never becomes a closed container slowly filling with the heat it produces. Most modern kitchen design gives no thought to this at all. Floor plans are standardized, windows are placed for aesthetics or for light, and the assumption embedded in the architecture is that mechanical cooling will manage whatever heat accumulates. This is not a criticism of modern homes. It is simply an observation that a problem was handed off to a machine that could have been addressed at least partially by geometry. The Amish addressed it with geometry, and the result on a July afternoon with 3 burners going is a kitchen that breathes. The cook stove carries an enormous amount of the story, and it is worth understanding in some detail. A wood-burning range, managed by someone who knows it well, does not produce heat the way a modern gas or electric cooktop does. A modern stove is either on or off, high heat or low heat, and the cook adjusts the dial to regulate intensity. A wood-burning range produces a gradient. The surface directly above the firebox is the hottest zone. Moving away from the firebox, the surface temperature drops steadily. Not randomly, but predictably, in a progression the experienced cook has memorized through years of daily use. By the time you reach the far end of a traditional Amish range, near the warming shelf, the temperature is gentle enough to keep food at serving temperature without any risk of overcooking. I think about a woman named Martha, who works in a farmhouse just outside Sugar Creek in Tuscarawas County, Ohio. Sugar Creek being one of the towns that sits at the edge of the Holmes County settlement, where the Amish population has remained dense and largely uninterrupted since the early 1800s. A visitor who spent a morning in her kitchen described watching her move between the range and the preparation table with the unhurried efficiency of someone for whom the stove is not an appliance but an instrument. The skillet came off the hot zone the moment the searing was done, slid back to the middle of the range where the residual heat would finish the cooking without any further input from the fire. The soup pot sat at the far end in a steady trembling simmer that required nothing from her. No adjustments, no watching, no risk of scorching, while her hands were doing something else entirely. She was not managing a stove, she was playing it, and the heat that radiated into the room above it was a fraction of what a modern kitchen running 3 burners at medium-high for the same duration would have produced. This matters more than it might initially seem. The total thermal load released into a kitchen over a 6-hour cooking day is directly connected to how the cooking surface is operated. A stove that runs at full intensity for extended periods releases that intensity continuously into the air above it, into the ceiling, into the walls, into everything within 8 feet. A stove that is brought to heat when heat is needed and allowed to fall back when it is not, and a cook skilled enough to use that gradient rather than fight it, produces the same food with a measurably lower impact on the temperature of the room. The cook is not less productive. She is producing heat with intention rather than producing it as an unmanaged byproduct. But the range, fundamental as it is, represents only one layer of how this works. The summer kitchen represents another, and here is where the history becomes genuinely fascinating. The result is an interior that runs several degrees below the peak outdoor temperature during the hottest afternoon hours, not through any active system but through the physical properties of the material the house is made of. Farmwives in Virginia and Massachusetts and the Carolinas used them in the 18th and 19th centuries, and for exactly the same reason. A kitchen attached to the main house, running full production on a July afternoon, transfers enormous amounts of heat into the living and sleeping spaces of the family using it. Moving the cooking outside does not eliminate the heat. It relocates it. The main house stays livable. The people sleeping in it that night are not lying in rooms that have been baking since morning. By the late 19th century, as American domestic architecture became more standardized and as cast iron stoves gave way to ranges that were positioned as modern conveniences, the summer kitchen began to disappear from most rural American homes. The transition was gradual and unremarkable. No single decision, no moment of collective abandonment. The logic that had maintained these structures for generations simply stopped being transmitted, absorbed into a new domestic culture that trusted mechanical solutions over architectural ones. What that separate building preserves is not merely comfort, though comfort is real and worth preserving. What it preserves is capacity. Dozens of quart jars processing in a rolling boil, tomatoes reducing for hours in wide, shallow pans, the steam and sustained high heat of a serious canning operation. Nearly every traditional farmhouse maintains a functioning summer kitchen or its functional equivalent. During canning season, which runs from July through September and represents the most sustained and heat-intensive kitchen work of the entire year, all of it happening in a structure that is open to moving air, positioned away from the sleeping rooms, venting upward through its own roof without those temperatures ever entering the family's living space. Dozens of quart jars processing in a rolling boil, tomatoes reducing for hours in wide, shallow pans, the steam and sustained high heat of a serious canning operation, all of it happening in a structure that is open to moving air, positioned away from the sleeping rooms, venting upward through its own roof without those temperatures ever entering the family's living space. The main house stays cool. The family eats their noon meal in a kitchen that has not been subjected to 8 hours of canning steam. The cook finishes the day's production without having spent it in a room that was actively working against her. What that separate building preserves is not merely comfort, though comfort is real and worth preserving. What it preserves is capacity. A person who has been working in sustained high heat for 6 hours is physically depleted in ways that have nothing to do with the difficulty of the work itself. Heat fatigue is its own tax, separate from muscle fatigue, separate from the cognitive load of managing a complex meal. The body, working to regulate its own temperature, is consuming resources that are no longer available for the work at hand. Moving the hardest thermal labor outside does not simply make the kitchen more pleasant. It extends the productive hours of the person doing the cooking. keeps her sharper later in the afternoon, and reduces the cumulative physical cost of a season's worth of preservation work. This was understood not through any formal study of occupational physiology, but through the most direct and reliable form of knowledge available, the felt experience of the same families in the same kitchens across generations long enough to see the pattern with absolute clarity. And here's the thing about that pattern that most people never stop to examine. The summer kitchen was not maintained out of resistance to change. The Amish are deliberate adopters, not rejectors, making careful, community-considered decisions about which technologies genuinely serve the life they have built, and which ones complicate it without proportionate benefit. The summer kitchen was kept because every generation that used it understood, directly and physically, what it prevented. They had cooked in both conditions. They knew what a July canning day felt like in an open-air structure with a cross-draft, and they knew what it felt like when all of that heat had nowhere to go. The building was maintained because the evidence for it was renewed every single summer by the same families in the same fields for 200 years. That is not tradition. That is a conclusion that keeps being reached. There is also the matter of scheduling, which turns out to be one of the most underappreciated dimensions of how this all holds together. In a modern household, most cooking that generates serious heat happens on the day the food is consumed, often in the early evening, which is also the hottest part of the day in the kitchen, with ambient outdoor temperatures still elevated and the sun still contributing through west-facing windows. This schedule is not chosen for its thermal logic. It is the default produced by the structure of modern work and grocery habits, and most people have never had a reason to question it. Amish cooking runs on a fundamentally different schedule, one that distributes the thermal work of the week across hours and days in a way that flattens the heat load dramatically. Bread is baked in the early morning, when the kitchen is coolest and the outdoor temperature has not yet begun to climb. The oven heats, the bread bakes, and the oven cools down before the day's ambient heat has arrived. Foods that require long, slow cooking, dried beans, stock, braised meat, porridge, are often started the night before, managed through the night at low sustained temperatures, and arrive at the morning's first meal without requiring any additional high heat cooking at all. The wood stove runs at low overnight, maintained not for intensive cooking but for gentle continuity, and the morning's kitchen begins warm rather than cold, which means less aggressive stoking, less fuel consumption, and less heat spike to manage. The hottest kitchen work is scheduled for when the outdoor temperature is lowest. The meals that serve the peak heat of the afternoon are assembled largely from work already completed. The kitchen is being used as a thermal system, one with a schedule, a logic, and an awareness of its own relationship to the day's temperature arc. Even if you have never touched a wood stove or spent a morning in a summer kitchen, this scheduling logic is entirely portable. You do not need a farmhouse or a half-acre or any specific equipment to begin thinking about your kitchen the way a cook in Mifflin County thinks about hers. You have a kitchen and it produces heat, and that heat follows the same physics regardless of what appliances generate it. The hours you choose, the sequencing of your cooking, the difference between building heat for a reason and letting it accumulate as a side effect. These are observations, not techniques. They require no instruction manual. They require only the habit of paying attention. The walls themselves are worth a moment. Traditional Amish farmhouses, particularly the older stone structures that still stand throughout Lancaster County and the surrounding townships, were built with thick exterior walls that function as thermal mass. Stone and brick absorb heat during the day, slowly without transmitting it immediately into the interior, and release it gradually at night when outdoor temperatures have dropped and the exchange works in the household's favor. The result is an interior that runs several degrees below the peak outdoor temperature during the hottest afternoon hours, not through any active system but through the physical properties of the material the house is made of. Root cellars, which remain standard and actively used features of Amish farm properties throughout the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic, operate on a related principle. Dug to a depth where the surrounding earth maintains a steady temperature regardless of the season, typically between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, a root cellar provides not just food storage, but a source of cold temperature ingredients that enters the kitchen at a temperature requiring less immediate work from the stove. Vegetables and dairy and preserved goods that have been kept cold overnight come out of the cellar in the morning already at a temperature that is cooperative. The kitchen does not have to overcome room temperature in order to begin working with them. This sounds minor. Over 6 hours of cooking, it is not. The whole picture, the orientation of the house, the gradient of the range, the detached summer kitchen, the scheduling of heat-intensive work, the thermal mass of the walls, the cold storage below grade, assembles itself into something that functions as a coherent system, even though no single mind ever designed it as one. It grew from accumulated observation, piece by piece, generation by generation, each element added or preserved because it was confirmed by direct experience in conditions real enough to verify it. The Amish did not theorize their cool kitchens into existence. They noticed what worked, kept what worked, and passed it forward to people who would notice it again. Walk into that farmhouse kitchen in Kishikokilis Valley on a July afternoon, with the corn already past shoulder height in the fields outside, and the sun angled hard through the south window, and the room is not what you expect. The air moves. The range is running, but not roaring. Something is finishing on the far end of the cooking surface with no one attending it. The temperature is entirely, practically, humanly manageable. The cook working at the preparation table is not in a battle with the room she is in. She is simply in a room, doing work, the way someone does work when the conditions around her have been arranged to support it. That kitchen was not built in a day. It was built across 300 years of people noticing the same things in the same rooms in the same seasons, and deciding over and over that what worked was worth keeping. There is something in that worth carrying home, whatever your kitchen looks like. Not as a prescription and not as an assignment, but as an invitation to look at the room you cook in and ask a question most people have never thought to ask. Is this kitchen arranged to support the work, or is the work arranged to overcome the kitchen? The Amish asked that question and kept asking it across generations, and the answers they arrived at are sitting there in plain sight. In the placement of the windows, the length of the range, the small building out back, and the bread already cooling on the board before the rest of the world has finished breakfast. If you find yourself drawn to this kind of practical, historically grounded knowledge, the kind that was earned rather than invented, there is more of it here, and subscribing is the simplest way to keep it coming. But the question worth bringing into your own kitchen this week is this: what is one thing about the way you cook that you have always done because it was simply how it was done? And what would actually happen if you started it an hour earlier, or moved it somewhere else, or gave the heat somewhere to go? Some of the best answers to that question, it turns out, have already been arrived at by people who had every reason to get it right.